for them to allow
Okay, just testing sound.
I heard you, Edwin.
Great. Thank you for the confirmation, Steve.
So, hello. Is that better? Okay. All right. I'm going to turn it off. The batteries, even though they've never let us down, but maybe they have. Maybe that's why we changed. I just turned it off. That's because you're getting it from my normal mic. Should I mute it? I'll mute it.
not get rid of it.
For all of you guys on Zoom, we're waiting for the debate to end, and we will start the talk at 7:45, giving us 10 minutes after this to go for the bathroom and stuff like that. So we're watching, there's a bunch of us watching the debate here.
We can do much better. They'll get much less money.
This is Ted Selker at Other Lab, and we're watching the debate. It'll be over in a couple of minutes. And then as BayChi chair, I will convene our discussion with Terry Winograd at 7:45. Thank you for joining. Okay. No, this is going to be the camera. Okay, yeah. So I just want to I want to welcome everybody to BayChi September 10th. This is a monthly program that happens and has been happening on this second Tuesday since 1989. And we have the best and most interesting people from the Chi community speaking. In the last year, we've had everyone from Don Norman to Peter Norvig and also Mark Stefik and Ben Schneiderman speak. So it's maybe sometimes a little bit old. In fact, last year we had Gloria Minsky in discussion for, yes. And I really tried to have Gloria Robin Minsky's wife talk about her contribution, which she was demure about, but I weaseled some things out of her. And in any case, so we are part of the, hang on, why am I? We are part of, we are part of the ACM. It's a 75,000 person organization. SIGCHI is the largest, believe it or not, special interest group in ACM. And this at times has been the biggest local group. At the moment, not. COVID was a little bit tough, and yet we are solvent, and we've continued to give talks. Probably we will be giving talks in Palo Alto again. We've been enjoying this beautiful space. I love this space, but it's a long drive for some of us, and just want to mix it up a little bit. So consider paying $20 a year and supporting us. It does cost money to run our web and other services and buy dinner for you as we did tonight. So on the first Thursday of the month, we have a tendency to have a 1 hour, very short talk discussion where everyone checks in that wants to be part of thinking about where we're going. And then we talk about the various issues, like where we're going to hold our programs and who's going to speak and stuff. And we welcome anybody to be part of those conversations. And we especially want people to volunteer and be part of the organization. We currently, the person that has been doing our outreach, telling people about the talks and stuff, is finding that she's trying to think of doing other things. So I'm thinking of if somebody wants to help get things on social media and stuff, it's an hour or two a month. Please consider helping. It's all a volunteer organization. Professor Terry Winograd, I first met in 1979. I went up to the DC Power Lab and I asked you about a paper you'd written. And instead of blowing me off, you walked over to the LGP and printed it out for me by yourself. And XGP, excuse me.
What that is?
Yes, of course.
It's the
Xerox graphics printer.
There were 3 in the country.
The ancestor of all the laser printers.
yes. So
One at Carnegie Mellon, one at Xerox, and one at Stanford.
yes. So Terry has done many things, and he started the Human Computer Interaction PCD, People, Computers, and Design program at Stanford. I tried to be supportive and help him as I could in that at that time. That was a lot of fun. And he has been very active in civic things too, such as helping with computer scientists for social responsibility, but also in helping start the D.school, which has been a very influential cross-disciplinary program that is revered by people all over the world and copied, and also people come to visit and find out about, but also it's been very productive for the students within it. If you want to learn more about Terry, some of us write thousands of papers. He writes books. So here's 4 books that he's written. And they've been very influential, very important books. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn from showing you slides to showing you us. I'm going to sit with Terry, and he's asked that I ask him that we do this in discussion instead of his normal giving a talk. Terry's very great. He's a charismatic speaker, and And that you can find lots of places where he's given talks, but tonight it's going to be a discussion. So we welcome questions and comments, and hopefully not heckling, but we'll see. I'm not sure if he's that controversial or what we say is going to be that controversial, but I'm sure Bruce can be counted on to heckle. We will decide, and I want you to ask, do you want people to wait till we're done, or no, yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this, and everybody online, you're going to, Edwin Lee, Vice Chair, will be noticing your chats and raised hands and making us aware of them. And he'll try best he can to get the camera to point at people as they're asking questions. When you ask a question, if we can, we would like to give you a microphone and have you state who you are, and so everybody can know about it, and probably point the camera at you. All right, so that is my little introduction. And thank you for all being here. And we have a lot more people online than we have in the room, by the way, just as if you're interested. And some people that you know are here.
In later years or earlier years. Yeah, so 2 weeks ago.
Putting this aside. Okay, now I will turn this one on.
Have to admit.
Can you hear me now? All right.
Using to come to a meeting of human-computer interaction people that have the same problems with technology that everybody else has.
Yeah.
We don't have any match.
We are switching you out to a different microphone.
Okay, I'll let you do it. Last time I grabbed it, I promised.
Yeah, right, because. Okay, does this microphone work? I can't believe it. This has happened. I have 2 sets for this purpose, and we never know which one's gonna crap out. I don't know why.
Working?
All right.
All
Well,
right, so before we start the discussion,
aha.
I did come prepared.
Oh, there we are.
And how did I prepare? Well, I went to Claude. Some of you may know Claude, the AI system. And I said, Claude, I'm giving this talk to the HCI, SIGCHI. What did I say? So here is the beginning. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, Claude's version. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues in the field of human-computer interaction, we stand at the precipice of a new era in technology, one where the line between human and artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly blurred. As we gather here today to discuss the future of human-AI interaction, we find ourselves not just as observers, but as active participants is shaping this evolving landscape. I'll skip a little bit, but this is just the beginning. The rapid advancements in AI capabilities are not just changing how we interact with technology, they're fundamentally altering the very nature of that interaction. As HCI professionals, we are at the forefront of this transformation. It falls to us to ensure that AI systems become more sophisticated. Skip the page. They also become more intuitive, more ethical, and more attuned to human needs and values. So let's embark on this journey together, a journey that promises to redefine not just our profession, but the very fabric of human experience in the digital age. Now, that's not I should have said try to do it in my style, because that is not my style, but it's what you expect to get out of the LMM generation, right? It's full of good words and not much content. So anyway, I thought I would start with that. And I have some more quotes from, not from computers, but from other people, but I'll bring them in later.
You bring them in whenever you'd like. You know, it's your party. I spent part of my afternoon with Stuart Card.
Oh, great.
And Stuart Card, who named our field and wrote the first book, described Terry as more brilliant than anybody recognizes. And it's possible that it happened because it was a seminal time in his life when he was 20-ish that he ran into Terry by way of being one of the main users of Sherdloo. And that's my point of
Developers, not just users.
Okay. He says that you were the guy that had to dive in when anything serious needed to be done. But what he described, he said many things, but one of them was this idea that when you were in a program, because the program was inside the context of the language that you were talking about, it had access to it in a way that programs before it hadn't. And I found that kind of an interesting statement, and I think you probably have a much better way of putting that than I just did. But do you want to say anything about that the perspective that Sherdloo had about what it was talking about?
Well, this simple version of that, and in respect, Stu was very much more into the cognitive theory side of things because he was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon with Newell and Simon, where I was at the AI lab with Minsky, which was much more engineering oriented. It wasn't trying to be cognitive science. What was different in some ways, not that there were that many natural language programs at all before it, because this is when computers just became usable for that, but was that it was talking about a very explicit model world, right? The blocks world, as it's called. So that when you said something or asked a question, it was grounded in its representation of that world and what it knew about it and what it could deduce about it. And I think that may be what he meant, that it was really in that world as opposed to just, well, what today's word, natural language stuff is, which is just more language. It's language about language about language.
So the way he said it is when you started talking about moving a block, it knew which blocks were around and knew how to respond to you so you could select from the blocks that existed.
Yeah, so it had a very
context,
explicit
and a model, right? Yeah. So that's that. And there's a lot, to be said about Sherdloo. It was by many people thought to be a seminal thesis. I think of it as being a linguistics thesis. I'm not sure you do.
Let me just say, Noam Chomsky did not think it was a linguistics thesis.
Yeah,
I wrote a term paper I took his course. I was at MIT in the AI lab, and he was at MIT for forever in linguistics. And I took his course in something in linguistics, and I wrote a term paper about what I was doing and stuff. And I got a C, which for a graduate grade is like, forget it.
Yeah.
And he said, you need to rethink the nature of language from the beginning. That was his comment on my work. So linguists did not think of it as linguistics. or at least Chomsky linguists.
Yeah, and yet,
If you know Optinger
No, he was at Harvard.
and
Uh,
just doing language on Russian and so on.
Yeah, he was doing the translation work. Were you involved with
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Ah, okay.
And Carl Hewitt.
Oh, well, so that's totally different. Ottinger was
So-
somebody whose name I knew. Carl was one of the key graduate students in the AI lab. And in fact, my work rested on his work.
Microplanner or planner?
Well, he did, I mean, if you want to know the truth, right? It's among friends, right? Carl Hewitt is this brilliant, but somewhat just, what's the right word?
Still alive.
ADHD.
no,
Oh, really?
no.
No, he died about
Last year.
10 years ago. It's been a while.
no, just a
Was it
year
just
and a half
last year?
ago.
Year and a half? Anyway, but so he had this idea for a language called Plattner, which did logical representation planning. And I said, that's exactly what I need. So can I use it? He said, well, I'm working on it. It's not quite ready. Da, 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 da.
So you were microplanning.
So I got together with Jerry Sussman and Gene Charniak, who were other graduate students there. And we did microplanner with the explicit idea that it was a subset of Planner, but an implementable subset. So
And the
that's-
authors of Microplanner
was
was,
Charniak, Sussman, and me.
interesting. I did not realize it was three people. Okay, I
Installed in Stanford.
So let me just, what you said, let me just make one interesting side note. There has been a recent effort, there's a guy named Lyle Bickley, who's very involved with the computer science, the Computer History Museum. And he and a group of people he has working with him are re-implementing Sherdlu from the hardware up. So they're doing a simulation of the PDP-6, which is what we had, running the original MIT AI Lab ITS operating system, running the original, of course, original means reconstructed, but Mac Lisp, is it called Mac Lisp? I don't think it was called. So anyway, the Lisp that ran on that system, running the actual Sherdlu code as best they can, running microplanner. And it's an amazing process because every step along the way, things don't quite work like they used to, and you don't have good documentation, and they change.
It's 1,000 times faster.
Oh, I'm sure.
I do it with weights.
So they do it, and they actually have built a model CDP-6 console. And what's funny about it, it's a plastic console with all the switches and buttons, and the entire computing is done by a Raspberry Pi, which sits behind it. Right. So what was the huge AI lab, we called it Moby memory, this stuff, is now being replicated on a Raspberry Pi.
it's worth for a $10 computer. What did people find seminal about Sherdlu?
Well, the thing that I think really struck them the most was that people had thought about computers and language in the sense of programming languages. You gave a very clear statement, and the statement was executed, it ran, and so on. And human language was very different because it had context. So if I said to go into the Sherdlu world, pick up another block and put it next to that one. Human language, we know what that means. When I said another block, it's related to some block you did before, and next to that one relates to its own. But that kind of casual context was not in computer languages at all. So the fact that it sort of put on this show, let me call it that, of being able to do the kind of implicit understanding that people do was, I think, very surprising. There was, like, Bill Woods, who was at Harvard at the time, did a program on natural language for an airline schedule system. So you could say things like how many flights leave Boston that will arrive in Chicago, da, 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 da. But he didn't push on this context issue. So it seemed very dry. It seemed like an extended database. Whereas Sherdlu, partly because of the concreteness of what it was working on, and partly because of attention to context, I think they said, oh, I didn't know computers could do that.
I mean, it just happens that, the whole relationship between things, prepositions, on, under, over, around, behind, that stuff is actually, for funny reasons, is the thing that autistics can't learn. So he was an anti-autistic
It was
program.
not an autistic program.
Yeah. But was it worth all the hype? I mean, now here we're looking at it from 2022, 5 or something. Or
Well, so if you can use the phrase all the hype, the answer has to be no. But at the time, I just actually was looking up quotes that I wanted to say something about, and I ran across one. I didn't type it out, by Herbert Simon, who was one of the founders of AI, along with John McCarthy and Narvin Minsky and so on. And he said, and this was in 1960 something, I believe that within 20 years, computers will be able to think and do things, anything a person could do. A man, he said. He was
Misogynistic.
yeah. Well, that was hype, right? I mean, 20 years passed by with almost nothing happening. So the idea that, I mean, the metaphor, and you mentioned, Bruce, you mentioned Hubert Dreyfus, who was a philosopher and a critic of AI. He said, you know, what's being done in AI is like climbing a tree to get to the moon. You know, you're getting higher, and you can sort of say, look, how much better it was than the last year, but you're not really getting to the moon. And I think the hype was, we are getting to the moon. It's just another few steps and we'll be there. And I think that was unjustified. Clearly it was.
Right. And then there's the explicit representational schema that people were invested in. Well, your stuff was, you had explicit model of this blocks world, which was a direction that everybody went, or many people went, you know, all the way to Psych. And now there's this opposite paradigm, which is collect all the data.
Yep.
And
so
I want, yeah, you want
yeah,
to
no, it
comment on
was
that?
interesting. I mean, whenever people say, what do you know about what's going on in AI? My first answer nowadays is, I don't know, because it's a totally different set of principles and a totally different operating method than we had back in the days I was doing AI. So I was there's a guy named John Hoagland, the philosopher, I have a quote of his, but who dubbed it good old-fashioned AI, GoFi. You'll see that acronym places. And the idea was that thought was representation, that when we do things, it's because we have in our brains something like data structures and algorithms that operate on those data structures, and the data structures are explicitly related to the world they're talking about, like the blocks and microplanner, and that you were going to get intelligence by increasing the amount of data, amount of representation, because we didn't think of data the way they think of it now, and better logical reasoning tools to work on it. At the same time, there was an effort to do what we now think of as neural nets. I mean, the idea of neural nets really started at MIT with, I'm blocking on the names of the,
Well, Marr. David
no,
Marr.
way before that. So I'm going way back.
Well, Heb, I mean, wrote the book.
Joseph Weizenbaum?
Anyway, I
No?
think the name will pop out in a minute. That's the way brains work. But and there was, you mentioned perceptrons. So perceptrons was a book. The idea of perceptron was basically a neural net learning machine.
Papert and Minsky.
Papert and Minsky wrote a book debunking perceptrons. What they said is single layer perceptrons are provably incapable of doing these logical things. They were right. Single layer perceptrons were improvable. Nobody could build multiple layer ones. They didn't have the amount of computation and technology to do it.
I built multiple layer ones. I told Minsky about it in 1980, and he said, that won't work.
That won't work.
Yeah.
Well, he was, yeah, I mean, I think he believed more than what they actually proved in the book.
Yes.
But there was no way that
But I did latent learning. But I did latent learning with it. So
it's great. There was no way that you could do anything very interesting with the amount of computation that we had, that people had in those era. They were right, given the computers of the time and given the data they had and what they could do. There was no way that was going to succeed. So when you mentioned earlier, well, you mentioned Dreyfus, you mentioned the book with Flores. What we said in there is that we've become convinced that the explicit representational model of the human mind is inadequate, and that a computing system based on that model is not going to succeed at being intelligent. There's a little footnote, not a footnote, but a side comment in one of the chapters, which says, now, if you look at something like neural nets, all bets are off. We have no idea what you can do with that. So the critique of AI was a critique of a symbolic representational approach to AI, And the idea of doing something that was more neural net-like just wasn't feasible. And we're talking about 20 years before there was the hardware to actually do any of it.
So you've obviated my next question, and it's a great answer that you gave. But is that when you kind of decided that HCI would be kind of a more exciting direction?
Yeah.
For you?
So I mean, to put a little history into it, when I came out here, I was at Stanford at the AI lab, and I was also consulting at Xerox PARC. And what I always say about Xerox PARC is, you know, Xerox PARC, they invented the laser printer and the bitmap display and the Ethernet. I was there, but I didn't do any of that. I was working on the natural language project. I wasn't working on all the cool stuff. I was using it. I was an early user of many of those things. But it was an attempt to take the representational ideas and go farther forward with them. And what happened over time, and it's always hard to reconstruct personal history, but it just became discouraging. I mean, it did feel like we were climbing the trees. I mean, we came up with something called knowledge representation language, KRL. I worked with Danny Bobrow. Some of you may know him. He died a couple of years ago. Very
Huge hero.
smart guy at Xerox PARC. And I didn't have the conviction that it was going to get there, that it was going to go somewhere. So then the question is, what do I do? And I could keep beating against that wall, and plenty of my colleagues did. Or I could say, I'm going to go learn about this neural stuff. I actually talked, maybe I should go do another PhD in neuroscience. And I said, I'm too old, too well set in my way, right? I'm not going to start all over again like that. But what if I give up on the hype, to go back to your word, that we are going to build computers that think like people, and instead ask the question, how do you build computers that are good for people to think with? The distinction, if you've read John Markoff's book, between artificial intelligence and intelligence augmentation. And in fact, Doug Engelbart and his whole group at SRI had what they call the augmentation research lab, and that's what actually led to all the stuff you hear about from PARC. So I said, I'm not going to make assumptions that I can do something that thinks like a person, but I'm really going to focus on the question of what is it that makes this computer system useful for people, makes it usable, not just useful and usable. And so it was about 1990, roughly, I officially, there's nothing very official because computer science department didn't have subdivisions that you were in or out of, but I said, I'm not doing AI anymore. I'm doing HCI, which is human computer interaction. And I started the program at Stanford, which was not terribly appreciated. We had a retreat right around that time. And at the retreat, they said, okay, let's decide where we're going to do our faculty hiring. What are the areas of computer science that need more faculty in our department? And they put up a big list on a whiteboard and had 11 or 12 things. And I said, human computer interaction, right? The first comment, and they opened it for discussion, was somebody who said, well, I was a CMU and I saw those guys doing human computer interaction and I think it's worthless. Right. So it was not like real computer scientists thought that it was a really respectable thing to be doing. But at that point I had 10 years, so what the hell.
Yeah. So about that time, I went into the office of the chair of the department. I think it was Ullman, and I talked about HCI, and he says, "We will never do HCI at Stanford." That's what he said.
Yeah, Ullman was one of the skeptics for sure.
Yeah. So what kind of a, well, I think this is a good time for us to talk about what fun did you have writing these books? Can you say some of the highlights of some of what you learned or what you unlearned or what you think was something that we probably didn't notice in one of these books? There's a pizza, that's an Easter egg you just told us about neural nets I hadn't noticed. What do you
Well,
have to say
each
about
book
this?
was fun in a very different way. So the first book I did was basically my dissertation, which got published in a journal and then in a book. And a huge amount of fun, right? I got noticed in the world. I got out there, gave talks. It was launching into the field of AI, and that was very exhilarating. Yeah. Second book I did, which I think about from time to time, was a textbook on syntax, processing of syntax. And I put a lot of time into it.
So why did I think you were interested in linguistics?
Yeah, right. Well, at the time, I was actually joint in linguistics and
I
computer
know.
science. And I see it sitting on my shelf still now and then, and I doubt it's sitting on many shelves anywhere in the world. But what was really fun about it is I did all my own typesetting. You remember, I come from the same department as Don Knuth, and he had developed tech, and we had the XGP printer. And it was just, and I did fancy stuff where, you know, I made up my own symbol structures for sentences and syntax and stuff, and then got it all to print out. And I remember going down to the bottom basement there in Market Jacks by then, is where we were. And, you know, waiting for the machine to put out these pages and so on. It was very different from what you do in a laser printer today. I mean, same in principle, but operationally different.
Paper tapes were involved.
No, not quite, but
They were when I was doing it.
so that was a lot of fun in a way which is sort of orthogonal to the content. It's about the process and about the mechanism. And then the third one, which is called Bringing Design to Software, was fun in a totally different way, which is I said, okay, what is design? And what relationship does it have to programming? And I've been talking, some of you may know Mitch Kapor. He was the original creator of Lotus 1-2-3, and did a lot of, and he always used to say, I'm not a programmer, I'm a software architect. What he meant, he had this analogy, which I thought was great, which is you're building a building. You can go to an engineer who will tell you about structures and beams and all that kind of stuff. But if you go to a good architect, and some architects are not good in the sense, but they're not going to start off with that. They're going to say, what do you want to do here? How do you want to live? What's this place going to, what's this environment going to be for the people who live in it? And he said, that's the kind of software architect I am. I'm looking at the environment that people are going to live in. I'm not looking at how the beams are put together. Somebody else can do that. I'll hire somebody to take care of that. So I thought that was a really good insight. And I said, there are a bunch of professions called design in different fields that do this. So I brought together a conference. I remember we were at, what's the name of that resort out on the coast by Santa Cruz? No,
Silomar.
No, it wasn't the Silomar, but it was
Somewhere.
Pahar Dunes. Pahar Dunes. And we got a dozen people or so, one of whom was a type designer, one of whom was an urban designer, one of whom was a mechanical designer, one of whom was, and so on and so on. Where all, what they had in common was thinking about the design of things, but what they had different was what kind of thing they were designing. And Kapor, who was thinking about software and so on. And then the book ended up being a collection of essays. I helped them write and edit the essays. So it wasn't really a book by me, it was a book facilitated by me, but it was, so the fun there was all in the people and the process and so on. And then the last one.
Just to give you an idea of how Terry, in my mind, is like that, is that for 25 years, he would sit in the front row every week and have somebody and celebrate somebody else's work, talking about an HCI from a different point of view.
Welcome to the seminar on people, computers, and design.
Yeah,
That was the tagline.
And also in his office with his students, there was also a celebration of other people's points of view and work as well. So that's just an aside.
Let me come back to that design book in a minute. But first, I want to do the fourth book, which was a really amazing process and learning experience for me because I did it jointly with Fernando Flores. And if you'll indulge me, I will take a 2-minute version of his life history, which is pretty incredible. He's from Chile. He was an engineering student at the University of the Católica in Santiago. And it was the late 60s when there were student revolts happening all around the world. Some of you are old enough to remember that, right? And Chile was included. And Due to some sequence of events, the details of which I actually don't know, he became effectively the provost of the university without having a degree and being 24 years old. He's a brilliant guy. I mean, I always describe him as somebody who can read 4 big books before breakfast. I mean, he's just a voracious mind. So anyway, and he was very active in the political party of Salvador Allende, who was the elected socialist leader of Chile. He, within a very short period, moved, after Allende came to power, from being the vice president of the state-owned organizations to the president of the state-owned organizations, to the minister of finance, to the minister of economics. And evidently he was about to become minister of defense, but that was close to the time that Pinochet carried off his coup. This is all set in 1976, to be precise. And through 73, sorry, 73. And bombed the Moneda, which was the presidential palace, killed Allende. Fernando actually had an office in the front of the building which was bombed, but he wasn't in the office at the time. And he spent 3 years as a political prisoner in a sort of bleak island off the south coast of Chile. And, south coast is not the warm part of Chile. During the time he was in prison, he was evidently treated relatively well because he was not somebody who had a following. Like one of his cellmates there was the head of the Communist Party in Chile. And they were worried, what would he do, right? Fernando was a whiz kid. He was where he was because he was really smart and working for somebody. And when the somebody he was working for was gone, he was still really smart, but he didn't have any power. So he was allowed to have some visitors and to do some reading, and he read a lot of philosophy and management stuff. And the San Francisco chapter of Amnesty International, I don't know if you know them, it's an organization that takes on prisoners, political prisoners around the world. And the way they worked at that time, at least, was a local chapter would take a particular prisoner in some country and advocate and send letters to the State Department. They would do all sorts of stuff to try to get them out. It turned out the San Francisco chapter had 2 people who were in the computer science department at Stanford. Whose name I'll also remember in a minute, Bob Floyd and George Danzig. And so one of the conditions that the Chileans put on his release was that he have a job already waiting for him out of the country. They said, we're not worried about this guy, but get him out of here. Right? So they, and this is an era when a little more flexible on hiring research associates and stuff. They hired him as a research associate.
We didn't pay them anything.
I don't know. You think he got paid? And I don't know that. I don't know. Anyway, so he was literally in prison on this island off of Chile, and the next day he was at Stanford. They brought his family to the airport.
36 hours.
What?
36 hours.
36 hours. They brought his family to the airport, and they shipped him to California, and the Amnesty International chapter brought him to Stanford. So I got to know him somewhat after that. Another story, but I'm not going to go into it. And we started just having conversations. One thing, when he came, the first time he came into my office, at that time now it was Polya Hall, not Margaret Jackson, and he looked on the wall, and I had a Chilean leftist musical group poster, Inti Limani, it's the name of the group. And he looked at that, and here's this computer science guy at Stanford, right? He said, I knew I was okay. So over the course of, well, ever since then, so we're talking 20, 30 years, but particularly between then and the time this book came out in '86, we just had a mutual education society. I mean, I was teaching him about computers and about artificial intelligence, and he was teaching me about philosophy and about politics and a whole bunch of stuff. And he ended up at Berkeley and ended up doing his PhD thesis there with Dreyfus and John Searle. Oh, no, it wasn't. It was Dreyfus's brother. Hubert wasn't actually the advisor, but he was very involved. you know, it's one of those, again, it's hard to reconstruct your own intellectual history, but that was a big part of my saying, I don't think the AI I've been doing is going to work. This is the 80s, right? And I said I switched in 90. So this was the process of moving outside of the representational. And the philosophy part of it was what's called phenomenology. Number of people, including Heidegger, which is another complicated story, but and the basic philosophical stance is that we do not relate to the world by having representations and symbols, that we relate to the world by, to use the jargon, thrownness, and that we're in the world and doing things in the world and reacting in the world. And then when we stop to think about it, we put it into articulated thought. But that's when we stop to think about it, when it becomes, again, to use the jargon, present at hand instead of ready to hand. And there's, I mean, as you know, in academic philosophy, there are millions of books written from every angle on this kind of stuff. But from the point of view of AI, what I was saying is the kind of representational view we were doing wasn't close to what people were actually doing. It was close to what people thought when they were thinking about what they were doing, but not to what they were actually doing. And that was part of my influence in getting out of the AI style that I was in.
Bayesian statistics an issue for you ever?
No, no, statistics were not an issue at all. I mean, it was like,
I'm more of it against McCarthy with respect to Bayesian
Well,
perception.
if we go back to this representation question, you're really sitting in this world where you're starting to think of representing knowledge and logical thought as quite disjoint from the activity of living and the interactions that are meaningful to people. Is there anything more you want to say about that? That's kind of, I think that book really, struck a chord in a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it struck a chord. And again, like you say, what about the hype? What do people like? But I think that it moved away from the sort of taken for granted assumption that if we could only figure out how the thoughts were all represented, we'd have everything. And it said, you don't have to worry about that. That's not how it all works. Now, how does it all work is another question.
What's it all about? Yeah. So we could move through more of that. But I guess I wanted to take a break and say, what fun did you have working at all these? You worked at Park, you worked at Atari,
No.
you worked at Paris.
Not Atari.
I saw you at Atari.
I visited,
Okay.
but I never worked
Okay.
there.
Google,
So
others.
yeah, so I was lucky enough, and being at Stanford during the time all these things were happening, right? As I said, when I first came out here, I was at Park, and I maintained that connection for a decade or so. There's a lot of really brilliant people there doing innovative work. I mean, I'm not going to give the litany of things that Park developed. You all know it if you're an HCI. Then it's always hard to put these into order, but let me just pick a different one. There was a guy named Dave Liddell who was at Xerox. He was not in Park. He was in a different division that was trying to commercialize all that stuff that the lab was doing. So Park was the lab, and he was in the commercialization part of it. And he left there and went to IBM. And as he said, I served time as a vice president at IBM. Then he got together with Paul Allen, who you've probably heard of. And Paul basically said, look, I've got plenty of money. And Park did all these wonderful things that really created the next generation of computing. So I want to do the next one. I want to be the one who brings together the smart people in the lab and does the next generation of computing. So he got Dave Liddell to be the president, and they created something called Interval Research, which was in Palo Alto, and brought in a lot of really interesting, smart people. Again, but that's what's great about being at all these places, is the people. It was an interesting question as to why it didn't succeed. One is you can't make lightning strike twice, right? I mean, did some interesting stuff, but you can't say it's going to be as big and as great as the other thing. But the other is the timing was just off, which is it started up with a very big emphasis on like physical computing, and devices, and all sorts of stuff like that, just before the web got big. And all of a sudden, all of the money and all of the energy and all of that was in the web, the internet. So some of the things which could have potentially gone farther just got choked out by everybody running off to do the web. So anyway, but again, that was a really fun place to, I'll tell you, going back to Atari, Brenda Laurel was one of the people who I helped hire for that.
Yes, I remember her. And Eric Hulteen.
And what?
Her then.
Ex-husband, Eric.
Yeah, her ex.
Yeah, right. It was at interval that she switched.
Yeah. I was in the meeting where she presented the concept of her interest in this particular person. So
and Joy Mountford, and there's a lot of
exciting people.
Exciting people there. And then Google. So I was part of the project was called the Digital Libraries Project. And this was a multi-university, multi-sponsor program back in the 90s. Yes, I could pin down the dates, but I'm not good at that. And the idea was, if you looked around the web, around the internet, wasn't the web yet, there were silos of information. There was legal information in Lexis, there was medical information in whatever it was called. And to get into those silos and pull out the information, you had to know the arcane specifics of each one of them. And so the idea, they said, is what if you could have some uniform way to access these different silos of information in a way that people could understand and master and so on, and think of the whole set of stuff that's out there as the digital library. Now, and so there was a project at Berkeley, at Stanford, at CMU, at a bunch of places. And what was interesting, again, in terms of timing, is that this was just pre the takeoff of the web. So when you said, what does it mean to have information on the internet? You didn't think about what we think about today. You think about these carefully curated, siloed information sources, data sources. And that was the direction we were going. And then, of course, being at a place like Stanford, you get smart graduate students coming in. And Larry and Sergey became part of the project. I was officially Larry's advisor. Yeah, well, not yet. And they said, well, there's all this stuff now that's appearing randomly on the web. Why don't we find a way to have uniform access to that instead of these fancy-dancy databases? And they said, why don't we just, again, I could spend an hour on the history of how Google developed, but they basically said, why don't we have a way of indexing everything on the web? And my first reaction was, you mean everything on the web? That's like tens of thousands of things, right? They said, yeah, we can do that.
It's only this many DLT tapes.
Yeah, right. So they started the project to index everything on the web. And it was fun. I mean, they were doing it out of Stanford originally, and got into, I remember we had this one whole hassle with the legal office being called in, because there was this guy who had some website that he had put up with his artistic endeavors, some other country, it wasn't even in the US, and they were crawling it. And he said, "You're stealing my art." And they said, no, we're not stealing it. We're just indexing it. Does it sound familiar in today's AI world? What constitutes indexing and stealing is stayed a big question. But anyway, and he said, I'm going to sue you. And we had to bring in the university lawyers. So there was lots of different things going on. But ultimately they said, well, the first thing that happened is they were not the first search engine, right? I was already using Alta Vista. And people were using Lycos and yeah, I mean there were a handful of different search engines.
Larry Messenger.
Yeah, I don't remember what. Do you have a search engine?
System 33 at Xerox.
Okay, Larry was just in the mind.
InfoSeek and Yahoo, and so
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, it doesn't.
Right, they all had it. But anyway, what happened to me and everybody else is a lot of these other engines, you would say, okay, I'm interested in this thing. And two problems. Problem one is you would say, okay, let me look up this thing I'm interested in. I'll get a cup of coffee and come back and see if it's found anything, as they're slow. And the other is what it did find was random junk, because it was whatever anybody has stuck in the, we had this big complaint from this guy who was a scholar of Abraham Lincoln. And he said, I did a search and I came up with these stupid term papers and stuff that kids have been put on the net about Abraham Lincoln, and I'm the expert. I'm sorry. How can they not recognize that I'm the expert? That's where PageRank came in, and they said, we're going to not rate pages by how much internal coherence there is, but by how much external validation there is. That was the insight. And then it got too big, and they went off to the garage. And well, they were in the basement. No, I don't think they were in the basement.
Second floor.
No, that was there was a display case in the basement, but I think the actual thing that's down there was in their office upstairs.
Oh, yeah. Too hot.
But
Well, that's where they had.
anyway, no, they went, I mean, sort of sad to recognize, they went off to the garage owned by Susan Wojcicki, who just died, unfortunately young, a little while ago. And then, so I said Ted mentioned that I had these weekly seminars. And I said to Larry, come give a seminar on what you guys are doing at Google. So he came and gave a talk on their attitude towards human-computer interaction, which included really good stuff, like you can't make people wait. That matters. It's not just a coincidence. You have to pay attention. Anyway, so after the talk, I said, Larry, you've got a lot of really good experience doing this. And I've got a lot of theoretical background from being a professor. Why don't we write a book together? And he said, oh, that'd be fun. So why don't you come to Google for a year and we'll write the book? I said, sure, then, because I was, we get sabbaticals every now and then. That's part of being a professor. So I planned on my sabbatical to go work on a book together at Google. I got to Google and he said, oh my God, I'm way too busy to do a book. But why don't you just stay here and help people, do stuff here. So I ended up spending a year plus a summer as an employee at Google. Back when the entire company got together in one room for the TGIF event. So it was one building, right? I mean, this is when it was already in Mountain View. It was just after it moved out of the office in University Avenue, but it was still, it wasn't San Antonio. It was
Building 43, right?
Yeah, well,
Was it Silicon Graphics building yet?
No. They didn't have that for a long time later. It was.
Oh, is that one-story building where
It was a one-story building. They had a building. This is Google, right? So they were building 0, of course, because you start indexing at 0, and building 1, and there was building pi. So anyway, so it was great. I mean, I got to really know what I was doing. What I worked on there was, two main things. One was I was on the team that was doing Gmail, which at the time was called Caribou. And the other is I talked to Rosenberg, who was the head of product, and he said, we have this system for associate product managers. And they were really pioneers in using this process. Associate product manager was a young person, typically just out of master's, not even a PhD, who was in charge of coordinating across the different dimensions of a product. So they had to think about the user interface, they had to think about the technology for building it, they had to think about the marketing. They were pulling that together, and that was what was brilliant about it, is that you had one person who really wasn't in one of those silos there. And he said, we've got these young guys, they're really smart, they do a good job, but they need some mentoring, some help with what they're doing. And I said, oh, you mean like graduate students? So I ended up having a handful of graduate students, so-called. I mean, they were not officially students, but at Xerox at Google for a year. So Google was a really good experience in that way.
So, because of what you just said, I want to move on to tell us some stories about some of your favorite experiences as with graduate students. What did you see them accomplish? How did you work with them? What was some of the fun things that you felt?
So
besides Larry and Sergey, which you
besides Larry and
have
Sergey,
gotten into. in some-
I had a certain approach to it, which was not the same as all my colleagues, which is there are some faculty who say, I know what I want to do. I have a vision. I'm going to get graduate students to help me carry out my vision. And that's great. I mean, I probably would have gotten more done in my life if I had taken that attitude. But I tended to be more parental, right? You have a young person and you want them to develop in the way they're going to develop, and you want to support them and help them with it. So I had graduate students doing randomly different projects. I had one who did using eye tracking. So you could control the interaction by eye motions. He ended up going off and becoming a venture capitalist, right? I had one, trying to think, I had a couple, I had 3 or 4 who were doing things around the Digital Libraries Project, which included Larry and Sergey, but included some other people. Michelle Baldonado, yeah, who you know. I had one sort of ended up with a very interesting trajectory. Martin Roscheisen is his name, and his thesis was about, he called them compacts, and I forgot now what it stood for, but it was having explicit commitments between programs, the details of which I've now long forgotten. But he, after graduating with that, went off and started a company to do what he called nano solar, which was a way of printing solar panels on reels of plastic instead of on hard chips.
In an unrelated story.
What?
In an unrelated story to his
Totally
thesis topic, yeah.
unrelated. And then after he developed the nano solar thing, which was somewhat successful, but the whole solar industry got complicated. He created a new company called the Diamond Foundry, which was here in South San Francisco, which lays down, it uses plasma deposition to create diamonds. So you've got these huge chambers that are reacting whatever carbon and stuff, and it lays down diamonds layer by layer. And they were trying to compete with natural diamonds for jewelry, because they could compete on a cost basis. The problem is jewelry, people have funny feelings about if it's artificial and so on. And their current thing, which is what he's doing, is diamond substrates for chips instead of silicon substrates. Now, how that came out of my PhD advising, I have no idea, but interesting batch of stuff.
But there was something you talked about along the way, which was promises. And Stu this afternoon said there was a very important topic around promises and social commitment that you got involved with. And he said you made a company around social commitments.
Yeah, it's another interesting side story. So again, it goes back to my friend Fernando Flores, who just today, he sent a message saying, can you talk tomorrow? I happen to be busy, but we're still in touch. His theory of language and management was built around the notion of commitment. That you could say things, and there are a lot of different ways you use language, but that the key to effective language was knowing whether somebody was actually committing to something, and if so, whether it was being carried out, and so on. And he has done for many years now workshops, management workshops, basically about this, very successfully. But he said, couldn't we have a commitment machine? Couldn't there be a way that when people communicate online, and remember now, we're talking about 1990, right? This is before everybody was doing text messaging and stuff. And so he came up with this idea, program called The Coordinator, company called Action Technologies. And the idea was, and as a business, it was oriented toward businesses, not towards private. And when I sent you a message, I did not send you just a message. I sent you a request or a promise. And if you replied to my message, you didn't just say in text, yes or no. You clicked the button which said accept or decline or modify. So you made very explicit in the communication structure the things which he said were underlying. I mean, those are all there when I just say to you, hey, you want to come to my house tomorrow? And you say, sure. I mean, that's a request and a commitment, but it's a vague commitment, right? And especially if you don't specify times and dates and so on. So this company called Action Technologies built this thing that was somewhat successful. Some people resisted it very strongly, saying it makes me feel like every time I talk to somebody, it's a legal contract. It was most successful. For example, they had a big successful deployment with the film company that did film work in the field in Africa, because they needed some kind of if you're going to show up tomorrow with the film, it's got to be there. It's not like you can say, oh, I'll get it to you when I can. All right. And
So Stuart,
processing two-phase commit, Gray.
so
yeah, not exactly the same flavor, but it's in that same world.
So Stuart said some very interesting things about this to me, which is he said, lots of customers, happy customers, but actually people don't think that way. And commitments have to be more fluid than that. And that was one of the dangers of that approach. What do you think of that?
This was, I don't know how many of you heard of Lucy Suchman. She was at Park, back in those days at Park. She was an anthropology PhD student from Berkeley who was doing an anthropology study of copier repair people. That's actually what she was doing.
And things like Colab also.
And Colab and stuff. Anyway, she wrote this highly critical review about the coordinator, basically saying that people don't like being boxed in by explicitness. In fact, and she had a very strong sort of labor point of view, which was vagueness is a worker's tool for avoiding being dominated by the bosses. That being made to be precise actually gave the boss too much power. So there were a lot of complications. And it's clear, we had stories of programmers who are not the most well-behaved of employees, throwing the disk. And in those days, it was on a floppy disk, right? Over the wall of their cubby saying, I'm not going to use this stuff, right? Because they were so annoyed at having to be explicit about things. So it was a very interesting, there's a whole literature about the pros and cons of doing this. So that was
no, that's great. That's great. I want, you worked really hard to build the d.school. I watched that a little bit from the side. Do you want to say something about the d.school? What was your role? How did you feel about it? Why did you engage in that? And what do you think about what it accomplished or didn't accomplish?
Sure.
Shallowness or depth or whatever you want to say.
So let me go back a little before that, which is, as I said, in the early 90s, I got into human-computer interaction. And of course, there were no courses, right? I was going into a new area. And so the question is, what kind of courses do you teach? And you can teach the history course. You can do the Ben Schneiderman kind of course, his textbooks, which say this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. But to really teach somebody to do HCI, they need practice. They need to be doing projects. So from the beginning, really, the curriculum that I did in HCI was oriented around project courses, not around lecture. I did lectures. Do my share of lectures, but really about getting people engaged and then coaching. Because it's not just you say, go do a project and come back, right? You say, well, did you think about this? And how do you do that? And so on. So it was a lot more in the mold of coaching than lecturing. And so I was already doing that. And then going back to Joy Mountford, who I mentioned earlier, had a program at Apple, which was trying to bring design thinking to people around the world. So she would, well, Apple would, but she was leading it, provide computers and a certain amount of coaching to schools anywhere in the world that wanted to create a multidisciplinary human-computer interaction course. So multidisciplinary said you had to have people from at least 2 different departments, and it had to be project-oriented and all that. So we didn't need the coaching in the same way, but we said, well, it'd be interesting to do one of that at Stanford. And I got together with David Kelly, who was also in the design book. He was the mechanical engineer in the design book. And we started teaching a course together for several years, which was a mixture of computing and mechanical. He was in the mechanical engineering department and the social sciences. We actually required every team have at least one person from each of those 3. And there was a project, and at the end of the quarter, you did a show, you showed your projects and all. Nowadays, it's not, I say that every single course, that's how you teach HCI. It was a little more radical in those days. And having done that for a while, he was on his own, but with other influences, thinking about doing the D.school, which was a whole program based on the same philosophy of learning by doing and learning by design. So he and I and 3 or 4 other faculty sort of said, why don't we call ourselves, well, what's funny is we said, we'll call it the D.school. He went to the dean, and the dean said, no, you can't call it a school. You know what we charge somebody to name a school? Stanford has 7 schools, right? And they just added one since then, which is the John Doerr Environmental School. He definitely got charged for that. So it was always informally called the D.school. Kelly insisted on calling it D.school, but it was never formally in Stanford structure a school. It was an institute. He got some money. He got a lot of funding for it from a guy named Hasso Plattner, who was one of the founders of SAP software. But it wasn't SAP that sponsored it. It was him personally. And then he created a Hasso Plattner Institute in Germany and so on.
And David did bring in a lot of money. You probably were part. I mean, in spite of what they wanted for a school, I think he brought in $30 million, right?
Yeah, but that's not enough for school. But yes, he brought in a lot of money, enough to. Well, again, if you know university politics, he brought in enough money to rehab a building, and buildings are where it's at. Right? So
that's kind of great. We're kind of, I know I'm going to wear you out if I keep asking these questions, but
take everybody else.
yeah, there's a few questions online, but before I get to them, I guess is user experience done?
So you asked me that question. You sent me a little. Here's some question I asked. And I thought, well, that's maybe only if users are done. I mean, as long as there's users, there's user experience, and those experiences change. I mean, if you mean does using a mouse and pointing at things, is that done? Maybe. I mean, a lot of things go away, but the focus, the design focus of thinking about the user experience, I mean, it's where we're at. It's not going to change.
Right, and I guess I think maybe we used to think in terms of egocentric, we're the computer and us, and that's it. And how has that changed?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question, which shows my having retired and aged out of the community in some sense, which is most of the time during my life, in my academic life, it was what you say. There's a computer, there's a person, what goes on between them? And my big job is to get people not to think about it as interface, but interaction. It's not the interface, it's what's going on, right? But, and in the past 10 years or so, I don't know the exact timing because I stopped going to the CHI conferences, but if you look at what's being presented, you really see the shift. It's not about a person and a computer, it's about people and other people using computers among them. Social networking being the big obvious elephant in the room, but the whole notion that what the computer is doing is mediating between people. And you want to understand the nature of that mediation and design the nature of that mediation rather than just me and my computer. And I think it's really taken a big shift in that direction.
Even. Hopefully supporting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, not that wasn't there many years ago, but it really, if you look at, say, the conference proceedings, it's just shifted tremendously.
So people matter, which is how we all got into this, I think. And when people matter, sometimes you want to do things to help society. And I know you spend a lot of time and energy worrying about society. I mean, even the interaction with Fernando Flores had a little bit of a flavor of that. But do you want to say anything more about other civic things that you did?
So this could be the start of the talk I thought I was going to give. It would take the next 2 hours, but I won't do that.
Yeah, we'll all be asleep.
One of the things I did, and this is back in the 80s, I was one of the founders of something called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. And the tagline on the bumper sticker was, "Technology is driving the future. Who's steering?" Right? And it was the basic idea that you could see that there were things that were going to happen technologically, but who was actually going to make them go in a direction that was good for people and you wanted to go? At the time, the main concern was military applications and the chance that they would start inadvertent nuclear wars. I mean, there was a whole set of issues that we were dealing with. But the basic idea is still the same, which is if you're going to have technology developing and changing the world that you live in, who is responsible and how do they exercise that responsibility for seeing what way it's going to go? And I think we're seeing that now with AI. I mean, to put it back into the context of AI, that there's a whole lot of discussion about things like, quote, alignment and a lot of terms people will come up with. But the really hard question is who, first of all, is going to figure out what it is they shouldn't do? And second, who's going to enforce that? I mean, we're in a multipolar world where you have countries, you have big companies, you have regulatory agencies, all sorts of things. And they aren't working in accord with each other, right? They all have their own motivations. They all have their own things they want to do. And I'll just say it straight, I don't have any clear idea of how that's going to work out. I mean, how we're going to, given the complexities of who has the power to make decisions, how we're going to in any way shape them to be what we want. I will read one quote. As I said, I had my quotes are along the line.
And then we're going to slowly transition. There's some questions that relate to some things you just said.
Okay.
And then there'll be
great.
some questions in the room that aren't Bruce. But Bruce will probably ask a question too. No, that's fine.
This is from my friend Brian Cantwell Smith, who was actually a student at MIT when I was in the AI lab. And he wrote a book called The Promise of Artificial Intelligence, Reckoning and Judgment, which actually echoes a book by Weizenbaum earlier on. He says, and this is just out of the middle, "I'm not worried, at least here, about whether AI systems will grow more powerful than we humans, or that they will develop their own consciousness. Two things do terrify me, though. One is that we will rely on reckoning systems in situations that require genuine judgment. And two, that by being unduly impressed by reckoning prowess, we will shift our expectations on human mental activity." So it's not so much that they're going to take over. I mean, they won't have, we have the choice on that in some sense, whoever we is, and I'm back to that hard question, who's we? But there is this shift where you begin to depend on them for things that they really can't be depended on. And then who's responsible for that? And how do you exercise that responsibility?
I mean, what that really makes me think of is, I love the way that was said, because I think we say, oh, we want the best thing to make the judgment. And if the computer's better at judging, let it do it. But maybe the fact is that whether it's better or not is a difficult thing to judge, because if we are the recipient and the requester, maybe our judgment is more valid than delegating it regardless.
Exactly. Let me, I won't quote directly, but there's a guy named John Hoagland who was a student of Dreyfus, philosopher. And he wrote this paper, which became very famous. There's a whole book about it and stuff. He unfortunately died young, but he said, the problem with computers is they don't give a damn. And that's where you get to this judgment question. I mean, the computer, the LLM does not care what it puts in this document. there's no notion about what it would mean for it to care. There's no care there. There's no responsibility. There's no underlying concern. It's just a process that cranks out stuff. And the problem with that is you get what you put in, right? I mean, you can't count on it. Of course, you can't count on people. I mean, people can do all sorts of horrible things, but at least you have a sense that they have responsibility for caring about what they do. Unless they're a complete narcissist, which we won't talk about. But
So one of the questions that came very early in your talk from Chris Ha is, what are some thoughts on perplexity and how hyperlinks and sources of attributions can make LLM easier to use as opposed to searching a search bar command type of interface like Cleverbot? The main thing is perplexity has this idea of attribution for things that it says.
yeah, I mean, attribution, you can get off into whole philosophy and language about this. I mean, what is attribution? It means you take for authority somebody else you can point to. Right? So if I attribute this to the New York Times, do you believe in the New York Times or not? Well, that we can argue about that, right? But at least that's a social decision to make. If I attribute it to some LLM, you don't know where it came from. It just came from it popped out of the processing. So attribution, real attribution is hard to, well, nobody trusts anything anymore, right?
Yeah.
So how do you have real attribution when there's not a bedrock of trust somewhere?
So a very different question that came up. I'm just starting to go through questions, and I hope to share it with all you guys. Have been very patient and great audience. Jeffrey Perone asks, I'm starting an organization called Financial Professionals for Social Responsibility
Cool.
to support people that are concerned with bank and insurance companies. I don't know why they exist, supporting fossil fuel projects. What advice do you have to offer based on your experience with computer professionals for social responsibility?
I mean, I'll tell you one thing from the experience, which may or may not be applicable, which is we had a very real threat and fear. So at the time that we created that, there was genuine possibility that computer systems were going to be put into use in a way which accidentally caused nuclear war. And that's a pretty big threat. And it's something which you really want to stop. Now, the problem with climate is not something as drastic and immediate as nuclear war, right? Yes, we're ruining the planet slowly over time. And how do you get the passion, get the focus on something that doesn't have that
I have
immediacy?
passion for it. Yeah. Another question from Chris Ha was on skeuomorphic realistic interfaces versus flat interfaces. And I don't know. I mean, we can go into that.
What's the question?
Yeah,
Yeah,
do you
right.
need a context or
Oh,
something? Do you need context?
There you go. Oh, is he speaking?
Yeah. Do you need context or something?
Okay, I will. I will turn on my.
Yeah, do you need context for that question? Unfortunately, I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you.
Chris says he can't hear you for some reason.
Now I can hear you again. Now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, but I can hear him. I can hear him. Do you want me to repeat it?
Please.
Go ahead, Chris.
You could turn
Yes.
your-
So
No.
yeah, I think for context, it's just kind of the.
Just
Go ahead.
Wait. Can I continue? Is everything fine?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to see what exactly was kind of the difference in terms of design paradigm, because I've noticed there's been a design paradigm shift from more skeuomorphic Steve Jobs GUI. Oh yeah, we're trying to make everything similar to an office desk and make everything really like the desktop type of thing, to a more flat design, a more bubbly design of, oh yeah, we're going to go and
Yes.
abstract everything
Go
out
ahead.
from the real world. So I guess, what are your thoughts on kind of that shift? Do you think it makes
know the
computers
answer.
more or less useful?
Yes. So the question is, it's sort of the classic question around skeuomorphic and then flat design is, what do you think of that shift? No. What do you think of that shift? And what do you think are the factors that contributed to it?
Which shift?
From the trade-offs between skeuomorphic and flat designs, philosophies.
So I
Just so you know, we can't hear him at all. The sound was much better previously.
Oh,
Yeah.
hang on. Apparently they can't hear you guys at all.
We can't hear you at all. Nope.
they can't at all now.
Correct.
Should fix that.
And sorry, I should have noted that myself.
Yeah. Left the meeting. Is that true?
Well, good night.
Is that true?
Um,
See me?
Ted. Let me search. Oh, yep, you're not there. Hold, please.
Just a second. Give me one.
The way Ted had it before was good, so if you can just restore it, that'd be great.
Yes, he seems to have been disconnected from Zoom, so hold on.
Thanks for keeping all the technical troubles here, Edwin. Thank you so much.
Because there's
Can you
no
hear me
physical
now?
correspondence to an alias, right?
Hello?
But there's still
That's
something.
working. That's good.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
So
can
that-
hear you.
Okay, so back, do you want to repeat?
Well,
your
no, I
question?
want to go back to the broader
Okay, please.
question, which is, to what degree do you tap into people's sensory and physical understanding of the world and say we can duplicate that? And we were talking about files and folders as something that was ultimately physical and had certain limitations and all sorts of problems, but was a good metaphor for certain uses. And the question of, let's just say VR and IR and AR and all of these things is, what do you gain and what do you lose by shifting to something which fools the senses more?
Makes it easier to adopt.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, it
it-
depends on what you're doing. But yeah.
I mean, the first time I had a telephone answering machine that was really good, it pissed everybody off because they'd get a message from Ted Selker that sounded like it was Ted Selker, and in fact it wasn't, and they'd be angry. So it's a matter of the expectations of the user and also what it does to their sensory. I love the way you said that about the sensory, fooling the sensory system. That is that really what you want to do is have people have the appropriate reactions to the things that they're interacting with. There's a question from Edwin Lee.
Oh, just to
Edwin Lee.
just to contribute here, I've always thought of that as a question of, analogous to the question of where is the wisdom lost in knowledge, where is the knowledge lost in representation, and so on, right? It's a question of what it is you want to support. Maybe it helps to make something look like felt on your desktop, but hopefully that's because of something else besides we like felt.
Right. Although there's
Like, it
something to be
hopefully
said for
provides
pure
something.
aesthetic design. That's another dimension. But it can't drive it. It's got to be a secondary thing.
Hi. I'm kind of new here, so I just wanted to say hi. My name is Rama Hetzline. I did a dual degree in computer science and fine arts at Cornell University. And I'm now a professor of interaction design here at California College of the Arts. And I guess my question is a little bit about publication and the direction that LLMs are taking. I've noticed there's kind of an increase, not just in HCI, but in computer science, but in lots of fields generally, of more publications and requirements for publications in AI, and also an increased focus on kind of like dialogue systems as a way to interact with machines over possibly other ways of either publishing or interacting with machines. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about how do we maintain this in the era of AI, how do we continue to maintain this kind of positive view that there are many other ways to interact with machines besides just dialogue systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's the newest, shiniest thing is always the one that gets the attention, right? I mean, so, and that's partly because the companies that are doing it really want that to happen, and the hype is conscious, but otherwise it's just the public mood and spirit and so on. I mean, hey, that's cool. And I think you just have to step people back and say, what are you really trying to get done here, right? Yes, that's cool, right? Cool things are nice. I'm not against cool things, but is it helping or hurting what you want to get done in this particular use?
And so what are your thoughts on, sorry, what are your thoughts on how we change the publication space in that? So a lot of journals are kind of like calling for AI, and there's a greater emphasis on AI papers in publication. How do we continue to maybe encourage publication that is broader than just that? Talking more about the publication space, not just the public reception.
Products or publications too?
I guess I mean like
Yeah.
Scientific publication, research publications.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good
Right,
question.
yeah,
I mean, the publication world has its own dynamics, power dynamics,
Yeah.
right? And if the journal feels they're going to get more readers or whatever their coin of the realm is, money, by having more AI articles, it's their interest in doing it, aside from whether it's good for the field or good for whatever. I think I don't have a good answer except put out good quality stuff that's not that and get people to want that.
Hi, I'm Elaine. So I work in design for AI systems now. And I'm actually curious, when starting the HCI category at Stanford, why was there a skepticism around that? And how did you kind of turn that around? And I went to Carnegie Mellon for
Okay, so you're
yeah.
one of those Carnegie people. So the answer is academia, like lots of other fields, has a sort of hierarchy of respectability. Our department, the Stanford Computer Science Department, actually started in the math department. It did not start in electrical engineering, which a lot like MIT, computer science was from electrical engineering. And there was a very strong underlying feeling that theorems were really important and gadgets weren't, right? To put it in overly simple terms. So in that context, there aren't very many good theorems from HCI. You can teach Fitt's law, but that's about all there is, right? So you have to convince people that what's respectable isn't just the logic of mathematical computation, which is great stuff if you do it, but is something else having to do with people. And then they say, well, why are you in computer science? Go do sociology or anthropology or one of those fields, psychology. And so it was interesting, it's going back to just my own personal experience at Stanford. The psychology department at Stanford for many, many years was totally resistant to this kind of stuff because they thought the only thing that was respectable psychology was repeatable lab experiments, right? That made it scientific. And if you tried to talk about people and what they wanted and how they did it, that was not scientific enough. And again, I mean, somebody once said computer science proves the point that any field that has to put science into its name isn't one.
Hello. Oh yeah. Hi, I'm TJ McLeish, Media Lab guy. I teach design over at Berkeley, like technology stuff. How do we get these kids to think? I'd love to talk to you more about that, but I think I have an opportunity here to ask you about Flores and your time with him. Did you ever have a chance to talk about CyberSyn or Stafford Beer? Or,
yes.
And how did that? how did that manifest itself and move
So,
forward?
if you're interested, I mean, have you read the Morozov work on that and Eden Medina? So send me an email, Winograd@CS. I can send you some references. There's been a book written about CyberSyn by a woman named Eden Medina, and Evgeny Morozov did his, who's very interesting philosopher of technology, I would call him. Not sure how to call him, but did a whole series of podcasts on CyberSyn. So it has a very interesting history and cultural embedding. For those who don't know, there was a guy named Stafford Beer, who was a cyberneticist, one of the very few at the time, from England. And he got drawn into I mentioned earlier that Flores was in the state-owned corporations in Chile. And he got connected up, I've read the story, but I've now forgotten the details, with Stafford Beer, and they ended up developing this whole system for managing the economy of the manufacturing economy of Chile using old teletypes, which they could connect in networks from factory to factory. And then there's a guy named Guy Bonciep, who was a designer, who designed this futuristic, it looks like it's out of Star Trek, control room, where all of these information from around the country came in. I think that was more to impress people that it was something important than to actually be a control room, but that's the way we do things. I mean, the quick answer is it was an interesting experiment, and it was completely cut off by the coup.
There's a question online, and I think I'm gonna stop our questions so that we don't all get sick tomorrow for not getting enough sleep or something. But somebody asked you, and I know one time I saw you recently, you said, "Oh, I'm writing again or meeting again with Fernando." And I'm not sure. I mean, at this point, there's no reason to write more books. But the question was, if you were to write a book now, what would it be, and why?
That's a question I get asked. I mean, it would have to be something in the social consequences of AI. I mean, to very broadly paint it. I mean, it's not going to be a technical book. I'm not doing technical work. And I think the place where there's a lot to be thought about is how do we understand what is going to be done? Going back to the Brian Smith quote, right? I mean, not is it going to be smart, but how are we going to use it?
Great. And I guess the last thing I want to make sure is that you consider asking any question of us that you want us to think about. That anybody, maybe has some.
What's the answer?
47.
Yeah.
I knew somebody would know.
See, that's why you married her. Okay. Well, with that, thank you everybody for being a part of this program, and I really appreciate everybody coming. And it's sorry it went a little late with the debate, but I think the debate was worthy of our attention as well. And I welcome you all to come to next month's meeting, which will be at my home. I've decided that I can save money by and time by having it at my home. We can fit
about
many
this size.
people. Yeah, it's yeah, at least this size. And so that'll be a lot of fun. We'll see how well that goes. Alternatively, there are some other places we can use in Palo Alto that we're considering, and I welcome other people's input to that. Please consider volunteering, and let's give a round of applause for
also
Terry.
thank Ted for putting us together.
And with that, thank you. If you can, we'll say goodbye to everybody. And everybody, I'd like Edwin, can you stop the recording and the